flourishing is a lifelong journey, and it's best to have conversations about flourishing with people who deeply care about you. And you can have this conversation with them about their flourishing as well. So what I will offer today in just a few brief minutes is an overview, but certainly not the end of the story. So the journey of flourishing unfolds within loving relationships over the life course. So we can pause for a moment and ask the question, what is health? And what is the deepest meaning of health? And how does health relate to flourishing? A narrow view of health has often been framed in biomedical and frequently largely physical terms as the absence of disease or impairment. A more holistic and relational understanding of health transcends a focus on physical infirmity and locates the individual in social, ecological, and even spiritual contexts, and engages with the concept of flourishing. Our ability to flourish is dependent on our connections with others. And as this image demonstrates, the material conditions of life are vastly different for people. But interestingly, when we've studied flourishing around the world, it's not always the group with the higher level of material wealth that experiences higher levels of flourishing. Across many domains, the more wealthy groups actually have lower levels of flourishing. And so why is that the case? And what is behind that? That's part of the journey that we're embarking on as we launch our collaborative project on global flourishing with Baylor University and Gallup polling organization. So we're in the middle of launching this project, and we have some preliminary data. But as a lot of other people have noticed, other scholars have noticed, as material quality of life goes up, other domains of well-being don't always follow. And in many cases, we are trading off some of our deepest sources of flourishing for greater material stability. And this has implications for health. So what is health? Well, a popular definition goes back to the World Health Organization's constitution, which defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And this definition is being circulated more and more, and it aligns more closely with a fuller understanding of flourishing. Howard Koh, one of our collaborators at Harvard, wrote this paper about being fully alive, which involves the full actualization of the person, incorporating the body, purpose, and ultimately the sum of everything that is part of being human. This was published in the Journal of Pastoral Care and Counseling. And we can think about health in these broader terms as connecting with flourishing. Howard and Tyler Vanderweel, who's the director of our program on human flourishing at Harvard, and their colleague Eileen McNeely, wrote a paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association that argued that we should reimagine health as flourishing, and that this would have some advantages. They note that, so first of all, what do we mean by flourishing? Well, the term flourishing has been used for thousands of years and literally means to grow or to prosper, and represents a powerful way to view health in its fullest sense. The concept of flourishing has the potential to capture health more broadly than existing wellness measures for both patients and populations. Asking questions related to flourishing can inform and refine many complex trade-offs for patients facing treatment decisions. The concept can potentially guide clinicians in assessing their own personal well-being, as well as delivering better patient-centered care. At the population level, too, attention to flourishing may represent a more useful way to address policy and societal goals than current options. Such an approach could open a national conversation that reframes and reimagines traditional health concepts of health. So you can see more about flourishing on the Human Flourishing Program's website at Harvard. We have a flourishing app that would enable anyone without any cost to take some of our survey measures, our individual flourishing measure, and some of our other measures. It offers some guidance for activities that have been shown to improve flourishing in one or more of the domains of well-being, and then also some articles and other resources on our website if this is of interest. When we talk about flourishing, we're not necessarily talking about the absence of suffering. Sometimes flourishing is one end of a continuum and suffering is the other end. But as one of the members of our community of practice has suggested, and she is based in Japan, and argues that flourishing is about the integration of suffering with more positive aspects of life, so that flourishing is really about wholeness or the flavorful life. And she gives the example of the Japanese tea ceremony, and this is a tray that she has prepared for a tea ceremony, where the participant takes a bitter taste and then follows it with a sweet taste. And the sweet taste is all the sweeter because of the bitterness. And this is about finding wholeness within life. This is about the delicious life or the flavorful life, not escapism in terms of avoiding suffering or unhealthy coping. This is about creative response to life on life's terms. And I think this is articulated very well in this book, Mathematics for Human Flourishing by Francis Su. Francis Su was a Harvard doctoral student who was on the verge of dropping out, feeling very disengaged and alienated in a variety of ways. And a professor reached out and offered support. And this really was a turning point for him. And he started to reflect on, what do we mean by flourishing? It's not, escaping from suffering. It's about wholeness of being and doing, of realizing one's potential and helping others do the same. This professor reached out to him, and now he's reaching out to others. So it's well-being for well-doing, of acting with honor and treating others with dignity, and of living with integrity even in challenging circumstances. So this is the distinction between meaningful and meaningless suffering. A lot of what we experience in life seems to be devoid of meaning or limited in meaning, and that means we suffer a lot more. But if we can somehow reframe the suffering in a meaningful way, we can bear it with greater creativity and have a response that leads to flourishing, in some cases post-traumatic growth. So living with integrity, even in challenging circumstances, involves creative responses to suffering. In order to be prepared to do this, it's helpful if we have developed certain habits of being, and if it's helpful if we're immersed in contexts, social contexts that have helped us to do this. So flourishing for Francis Su comes through the exercise of virtue. And virtue is excellence of character that leads to excellence of conduct. So he claims in this book that the proper practice of mathematics cultivates virtues that help people flourish. This was never fully explained to me in any of my math classes. I think I would have paid more attention and saw the bigger picture had I had this kind of approach explained to me. And he ends this book on math with a chapter on love. And so if math has this aim, why not all human endeavors, including healthcare and medical education? So we can think about the education process as loving students into being, helping them become their best possible selves, helping them deal with challenging circumstances with integrity and to find wholeness. And ultimately, healing and wholeness are very closely related. So what are some different frameworks for understanding flourishing? We're not suggesting that we have the right one or the only one. We have one that's been empirically useful. And we think it is helpful to begin some conversations with it. So this is our framework with the domains of happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. And then we argue that financial and material stability is necessary to sustain these domains over time. But money is really a means to an end and not an end in itself. So these other domains, most people, most of the time throughout the world, would agree that these are ends in themselves. We value meaning and purpose. We value a sense of happiness as an end in itself and not just to attain some other end. And we recognize that these different domains, we can see these as outcomes, are shaped by a number of important institutionalized pathways. The family, work, education, religious community, and others are all profoundly important in shaping flourishing. So if we want to think about flourishing as complete well-being, it would at minimum include engagement with these domains. It doesn't mean that we realize maximal levels of all of these domains at any one point in our lives. As any parent knows, waking up in the middle of the night to change diapers for an infant, sometimes the sense of meaning and purpose is quite strong, but happiness or even emotional health, or sometimes even physical health is reduced. So life often involves trade-offs, and it doesn't mean that we're not flourishing. It just reminds us that flourishing is multi-systemic, and we can attend more intentionally and skillfully to the trade-offs if we're more aware of how things are going across these domains. Again, this is a starting point. The Blue Zones approach, I think, is also helpful, and it involves the creation of a well-being ecosystem, grounded here in the middle at the base of this pyramid in a strong sense of belonging and strong, healthy social networks. And so that's another framework that has been used in some healthcare settings. And then all the way to the right, the International Multiple Sclerosis Foundation offers this multi-systemic look, which starts with, in the upper left, the individual's attitudes, individual's mental health, individual's physical health, but also linking that to the immediate circumstances, the broader set of relationships, the home and local community, education, finances, and other things that are in one's immediate neighborhood or circumstances or community. And then at the broader environment as well, we have to pay attention to national stability and security and culture and societal attitudes. So linking flourishing across the individual, the community, and the broader society and even world offers a multi-systemic look at flourishing. And we would argue that if we pay attention to all of these levels in a thoughtful way, we're better able to make informed choices and be more skillful about promoting our own flourishing and the flourishing of others. We have offered recently a book that you're able to download without cost from Oxford University Press called Measuring Wellbeing: Interdisciplinary Perspectives from the Social Sciences and Humanities. We don't think that any one discipline has a monopoly on wisdom with regard to flourishing. We use the phrase well-being in this book because there's a broader literature on well-being, and flourishing is perhaps the more recent term, but it's gaining a lot of traction. But again, thinking about flourishing as complete well-being, I think this book is quite relevant. We could measure flourishing subjectively at the individual level. And in fact, in chapter 14, written by our programs director, Tyler Vanderweel, in this book, you can see this figure showing the different kinds of measures and different levels of analysis. So we can measure flourishing subjectively at the individual level or at the community level, and we can use more objective indicators as well, both at the individual level and at the community level. And depending on resources and time and other material considerations, we can do more of this and have a more complete picture of flourishing. We can also assess the impact on the natural environment as well. And so the more information we have, the more complete the picture. But interestingly, I think importantly, objective and subjective health measures do not always align. They don't always coincide. As one of our colleagues at Harvard has written, a person living in a community with many diseases and a poor healthcare system may be inclined to underestimate their own health condition, taking as normal symptoms that are clinically preventable or treatable. So we wouldn't want subjective understandings of well-being or flourishing to be unhealthy. We would want there to be some kind of correspondence between objective indicators and subjective indicators. On the other hand, we wouldn't want to discount the importance of an individual's subjective experience. So in this bottom quadrant of this figure, I've placed the picture of Emeka Naka, who was a semi-professional football player who was paralyzed on the field, trying to make a tackle. And as a result of losing the ability to walk, he then had a kind of awakening about, what it means to really be a good person and what it means to live a flourishing life. And in the aftermath of this accident, which left him paralyzed, his flourishing seemed to improve. He was not doing well in his college classes. He ended up getting a master's degree. He's now an inspirational speaker and mentor to many people. And he's quite a flourishing person by all accounts. And I think it's important for us to accept if he says, I'm flourishing, not to say, no, you can't be flourishing because one of your domains objectively is, you have a low score because of this paralysis. So I think it really is helpful for us to have a dialogue about how the subjective and objective indicators are giving us information about flourishing, and then also the individual and community level. We can connect flourishing and well-being domains to concerns with equity. Sometimes there's a concern that we are focusing on individual happiness at the expense of other groups or at the expense of the planet. And in fact, a lot of systems are kind of stuck in what the Wellbeing in the Nation Network and other groups have called an adversity economy, meeting urgent needs, perhaps, but not getting to the roots of the deeper causes, and meeting these needs in ways that sometimes reproduce patterns of trauma and exclusion. So this is the idea of resilience in a hostile environment, or resilience amidst adversity. And it's important to meet needs, and it's important to shine the light on resilience and have inspirational stories about overcoming the odds. But it's also possible for us to shift into a well-being economy. And this is illustrated by the garden here, where you create healthy soil, you get greater flourishing for more people. And this is why the top part of the model here focuses on expanding vital conditions for all people, and grounding this expansion in a fundamental concern with dignity and inclusion. And this leads to this question, to what extent does our healthcare system or our medical education process or our university education process reflect an adversity or well-being economy? So we can begin to conceive ourselves as stewards of the broader system, in addition to trying to meet immediate needs and find higher levels of well-being for ourselves as individuals. We have a role to play in unlocking the potential by expanding vital conditions in the top part of this model. I'll just make a quick note. I know I'm running short of time, about some of our survey findings. So if we look at average scores out of a possible 10, both before and after the COVID lockdown in 2020, we can see that in the US, with a relatively representative sample, that most people score in the high sixes or low sevens on most of these domains of flourishing that we measure: happiness and life satisfaction, et cetera. Financial material stability is a bit lower. And then during the height of the lockdown in June 2020, another snapshot with survey research revealed some significant declines. Financial material stability, as we would expect, declined quite a bit. Mental and physical health went from an average of 7.1 to a 6.4, which is a pretty substantial drop. And yet character and virtue held steady. So our sense that we're trying to do good and, become better people might be a domain that we can focus on when we're experiencing sadness that follows from loss, perhaps a death in the family or a lost job or something like that. It's not unreasonable for our sense of happiness to decline, for our experience to be quite negatively psychologically valent. That doesn't mean that we're not flourishing. We're just recognizing that flourishing is multisystemic and still trying to do the best we can to become, better people. So that's, again, the beginning of a conversation, not the last word by any stretch of the imagination. What about flourishing in medical school contexts? Well, some of our colleagues have done some empirical research that they've published in the Journal of Graduate Medical Education, and others within our program have had some more informal kinds of conversations with medical students. But it seems like on average, medical student and medical resident well-being scores are somewhat lower on average than scores for other US workers, but higher perhaps than for a US community sample, except, and this is really critical, for mental and physical health and maybe happiness and life satisfaction. So I've underlined the physical health score for medical residents at Johns Hopkins, and this is a 5.4 out of 10, possible 10. This is the lowest score that we've seen and gives us pause as we're training people to bring greater health and well-being to others that they care for. And through their process, they report not having very good health. So the physical health scores are especially troubling. And some medical students feel social pressure to appear to be flourishing while lacking guidance on growing as a person. One of our research affiliates followed up through focus groups, asking for first semester medical students for their input on envisioning an authentic environment for physician development. And after some discussion, one student offered, "No one is telling us how to become an adult," which was met with nervous laughter and some applause. And in some cases, students were overinflating their responses on the survey in order to have the kind of self-talk that I'm doing okay, I'm going to get through this. But actually, an authentic response might be quite lower. And they wanted some more conversation about how do we deal with the allostatic load in our own bodies, even as we're counseling, learning how to counsel patients to deal with their allostatic loads. So in this article in the Journal of Graduate Medical Education with medical residents in internal medicine and psychiatry, it was found that low quality of life, high emotional exhaustion, and lower empathic concern were all associated with lower flourishing scores, and that almost half of the respondents were dealing with emotional exhaustion. So the mean flourishing index and secure flourishing index scores, and this just depends on whether you include the financial component or not, across all residents were lower than previously established means among very low paid and precarious workers in factories in Sri Lanka, Mexico, China, Cambodia, Poland, and in 4 US samples. So much more financial precarity, self-reported financial precarity, but higher levels of flourishing across all domains for these other samples. So that gives us pause for reflection. I guess maybe I'll leave us with this rather than ending on a potential negative note, that flourishing, whatever else it might mean, will involve the joy of loving others into being by creatively transcending difficult circumstances. So this is the story of Akbar Cook, who was a high school principal in a school district where students in the summer were being victimized by becoming a crime victim. And he decided, I'm not going into summer being a bystander. We're not going to keep our doors closed while students are being victimized in this way. He grew up in the Boys and Girls Club, which provides this, welcoming space. So let's open our doors when all the crime was happening to provide a safe space for students. There's nothing in the principal's, manual, standard operating procedure manual that suggests that this is his role or this is the role the school should play. But he took a kind of creative social entrepreneurial approach. And he said they needed us, so we loved on them and provided all these resources. We had to go at them a different way, and we've led with love. being consistent and loved on them until they realized we weren't going anywhere. And then he says, kids weren't coming to school. They weren't showing up because they had dirty clothes and they were getting bullied. So what's the school's responsibility there? We might say nothing, but he says, well, what can we do? We can marshal some community resources. And now the school has 5 commercial grade washing machines and dryers to help deal with it. It's not a perfect solution. It doesn't get to the deepest roots of injustice and other things, but it's a step on the path to meeting needs so that we can shift to become a better steward of the system by taking these initial steps and leading with love. And so I think that we all have opportunities to think about, the metaphorical washing machines that we can bring into our own context so that we can meet needs and then begin to become better stewards of the system, so that flourishing is connected with a deeper sense of equity and well-being for all people without exception. So I think I will leave it there. I apologize for going a couple minutes over.